Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's very late on a very intense day, so I really appreciate it that you are here. Um, you've all read what this topic is about. So just to focus, well, just to inform you, I'm not a lawyer, okay? I do divorce counseling and I do divorce mediation. So I work a lot with the legal aspects, but this is in no regard legal advice that you're getting. However, all of us know somebody who has been through a divorce or is busy divorcing somebody that is in a very high controlling relationship, either a cult or married to somebody with a destructive personality, let's call it that. So first of all, we're going to focus on four things. Firstly, what separates divorce counseling from other types of counseling and the different types of divorce counseling. Then the exaggerated emotional turmoil that is there when you need to divorce somebody that is in a cult. Then we'll look at the legal aspects quickly that we need and a quick course of action, what we can do to help and support people that are in such relationships and trying to get out of it. So firstly then, when I get people that come to me for divorce counseling, it's usually one of two circumstances. Either something happened, there was infidelity or something like that, and they want my guidance to help them tell the children to know what's going on. And they really want everybody to be as okay as possible in these difficult circumstances. As you can imagine, that's not what we're talking about today. Because when you divorce somebody in a cult, or when you get divorced because you were in an abusive relationship, then the focus will be completely different. So both of these groups have these points in common. When they come to you for counseling, you need to understand and navigate the feelings that they have, and you need to help them cope with life, with work, with their relationships with children, and everything else like that. You also need to help them find positive outlets for their frustrations and teach them how to co-parent effectively, because that's in the best interest of the children, and they want that. And then lastly, they need to help to deal with all the changes, the financial changes, etc. But then when you do divorce counseling for somebody that comes out of an abusive relationship or that is still married to somebody who's in a cult, there is some added focus that is really important. First of all, it must be practical. It must be practical because they need practical help right now, especially if they were also in the cult before. If they were in the cult, there's a lot of indoctrination that's probably still part of their thinking processes. And you need to clear things for them. Just help them to take the fluff away. And obviously not getting them to be dependent on you then in exchange. Secondly, you need to help them understand what happened in the past, because there's a lot of patterns that they probably don't even know was destructive to them. So they need to realize that in order to heal from it, but also, and we will get to that later, to clarify it for their legal team so that they can know what to focus on in the process when the children are involved. And I think the most important thing at that stage when they come to you is to help them to guide their own self-talk and to be more confident. They have to make quick, conscious, confident conversations with themselves so that they can try and be more rational under the circumstances. And later on, when the process is finished, even during as well, but especially after everything happened, then you can help them with the healing and work through even more things. But you need to guide them to keep their focus where it is the most necessary through the process. And obviously that is the children, if there are children involved. What I do is, in that second case, I give them a paper because they are often so overwhelmed in the first session of 50 minutes or an hour that they forget half of what you said. So I tell them, this is what I'm going to be doing. Is there anything that you don't want? If you don't want me to be involved in this or that, you can tell me. If there's anything extra, you can tell me as well. But this is what I offer under these circumstances. And usually they really appreciate it because it gives them some clarity in a very confusing situation. So secondly, I said we're going to look at the exaggerated emotional turmoil. For children of different ages, it differs, but almost always people accept that children suffer more in abusive households where there's high control than they do after a divorce. And as I said, it's not always the case, but it's often the case. And what we need to look at is when the one parent is in a cult, it's not necessarily like that because the difficult circumstances, the high conflict still remains even if the parents are divorced. And it's often even worse then because then they have even more ammunition to use against the other parent. So what that will look like is the emotional impact on the children is that there's a heightened amount of negative emotions. The children already, when parents get divorced, especially younger children, they feel guilty because the parents get divorced, even if it's not their fault at all, they do. But when the one parent is part of a cult, they feel even more guilty because that's what cults do. They make you feel guilty in order to manipulate them, in the people that's inside the cult, even the children. And I'm sure many of you know that already. Another thing that's important here with the emotional impact is these children often feel that they don't really belong anywhere because the one parent is in this exclusive group and they are the only ones who might go to heaven or whatever the group says, and the other parent is not. But they realize, I'm part mom and I'm part dad, so where do I belong exactly? And nobody in those circumstances, it's often the case that nobody can really help them to work through those feelings because the parent that is inside the cult will never allow the child to go to a therapist who's not also part of the cult. And the other parent will hopefully not want their child to go to a therapist that's inside the cult because that just heightens the indoctrination process. Secondly, the relationships that are being modeled is also very inconsistent, unstable, and fragile because the out parent is not good enough for the parent who's inside the cult, and the parent inside the cult is not good enough for anybody because that's how it works when you manipulate a person. You have to keep them under your control. So they need to better themselves all the time, even if it's not rational. And that's the only relationship models that these children often see. At school, if they're in a public school, for example, that's not really what is being taught. And the people, even at schools, are very careful not to say anything to upset the parents these days. Usually it's a good thing, but not always. Next, then, the academic and social outcome. We all know that you can't really focus on your work as well as you should when there's emotional problems in your life. So these children often struggle academically, and also they are a bit socially awkward because they don't really belong anywhere. The people inside the group might look at them strangely, especially if there's joint care, because they're not always part of the group. Half of the time they're with the mom or with the dad and not part. And the people outside will look at them strangely because they are, in a certain way, part of the group. And that's very difficult for the children. So I don't know if there's somebody here that does play therapy, but it's very important to keep that in the back of your head. And what I found is it really helps if there's a therapist at school, because then it's part of the school system. It's not always the parents that need to give permission for the child to go there because it's on the intake form when you enroll the child at school anyways. So I really enjoy working with them. Then the parent-child relationship. Earlier when we spoke, we touched on parental alienation. And you all know a lot about cults, so you can imagine what a big role that plays. Because the one parent the parent that is inside the group does not want the child to have too much contact with the other parents, especially if there's shunning and everything taking place when that person leaves the group. So luckily, in these circumstances, that's an important thing that we can use in the court system, because the court is really not in favor of parental alienation. Then the stability, it's continuous instability because of the lack of effective co-parenting. I'll touch on that a bit more later. And the whole thing of children developing their identity is very difficult because of the two groups. So that's in short. But what we need to focus on when we talk to parents about these situations is, how do you support a child whose parents are getting a divorce? The usual things we do is we tell the parents to often remind the child that both parents love them and not to blame the other parent in front of the children, even if you might feel it. And I'm talking about, let's call it, more common types of divorce if one parent is not in a cult. We also help them to keep the daily routines as much as possible, to encourage open communication about feelings so that the children can work through these feelings, and to co-parent positively. All of these is really difficult when one parent is in a cult, because they will not remind the child that the other parent loves them. Even like one of the fathers said, my daughter is being told that this leader is love. I'm not part of the group, so therefore I can't really love her. And that's not possible. The next one, avoid blaming the other parent. As you all know, when you're in a group, the outside world is to blame for absolutely everything negative. So that's not a realistic expectation from a parent that's inside a group. Next one is to keep the daily routines. One father that I spoke to said this was so difficult. They had two little daughters, not even in primary school yet. And the group forced the mother, she was inside the group, he wasn't, to go to sport practices, choir practices, parent evenings. And these things often carried on until 11 in the evening. And the children, unlike in Spain, I was very surprised when I saw all the young ones walking around last night. In South Africa, the school starts at 7:30. So they need to be up and awake and at school by that time. So it's very difficult for them. They're tired, which again influences the academic performance. And they get the message that they are not as important to this parent as the group is, which obviously is not good for your emotional health and well-being. Encouraging open communication about feelings. Again, it's a problem because when you're inside a group, you are only encouraged to feel the things that they either tell you to feel or that they are okay with. And when you miss your parent who's not inside the group, those feelings will not be encouraged. So very difficult for the child to manage that. And co-parenting, obviously, those two are not going to communicate well. And I'll mention it later on again, but can I just see how many of your countries, because you're all from different ones, have parent coordinators? Do you know? You have? South Africa, yes. Do you know what a parent coordinator is? Sorry, maybe I should start there. It is when two parents have a very high conflict relationship with each other. It's often appointed by court or by other legal professionals that there's a third person who can coordinate the parenting, quite literally. So I do parent coordinating as well. And when one of the parents have a problem, they say, listen, we need to set up a session and we've got a session to make decisions. And if they can't decide on what is best for the child, then the parent coordinator, obviously you try mediating the situation because it is their responsibility. But if that's not possible, and if you can see that it's really not in the best interest of the child, what they propose, then you can make a directive. And that is binding until they take it to court so that it can be, decided on. It's really very effective. I started that about 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm so impressed of, with the whole system, actually. The problem is that not everybody can afford it. So there are people that do it pro bono, but not always the case. If it is at all possible, try and Google it a bit, see if it is in your countries. And if not, you can ask your legal team if somebody can be appointed by court to help navigate this. Because in one of the examples, one of the fathers that I spoke to as well, he said in their group that the mother was in, they had parent evenings, and only the members of the cult are allowed to go to the parent evenings. And at these evenings, they tell you how to raise your children, what discipline to use, etc., etc. But the mother wasn't even allowed to talk to him about it and tell him what was being said at these evenings. So there's no co-parenting happening. And that was when they were still married. But if, when they get a divorce, you can get a parent coordinator, you can sit in the session and tell them, you need to make this decision. Because something else that happened in this specific group is, when you have any questions about child rearing or discipline or anything to do with a child, you need to go to the person a bit higher than you in the hierarchy, to your leader, so to say. And if they're not sure, they need to go to their leader. And it's a whole pyramid basically of leaders and decision makers until you get to the top. But if that is the message that you got from the group, let's say, for example, how to discipline your children, that is exactly what you have to do. So if there's conflicting ideas between the two parents on how to discipline the child, the one parent that's in the group will insist that this is the way to do it, because otherwise they get a lot of problems from the group. Yes, please.
If you did go to a coordinator in cases and it is against one of the parents' wishes after what the coordinator says, do they respect the coordinator?
Well, often no, but then it's a directive that was given. So then the other parent can go to the family advocate in South Africa's case, or they can talk to their lawyer and say, this is the directive that was being given. It wasn't respected by the other parents, so what do we do now? And then a legal process will start. But if you believe that there is something, if the child is in danger, then obviously you can put things in place and they can tell their lawyer, please contact the parent coordinator, just ask what happened here and what are we supposed to do now. So in that case, obviously the parent coordinator should be unbiased, right? But they always think of the best interest of the child. So if there's something happening, they can't enforce things. They can give the directive, but obviously they're not in a position to actually put the child in a car seat, for example, because that is what the law says and the one parent is just ignoring that. But they can go to their legal counsel and tell them, this is the directive that was being given. Here are the proof. Here's the proof that the other parent didn't respect that. I think the child is in danger. That's why the directive was being made. So what do we do now? And then they can take that process further, hopefully as quickly as possible. Like in the case, also, we'll touch on it later, with blood transfusion. Because as you know, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't allow it. So what do? If one parent is part of the cult, the other one isn't, and the child needs blood transfusion very quickly, it's obviously a problem. But then you can, take that route. Thank you for the question. I want to encourage you to speak with her. I have so much to say and I speak so quickly, but please just say if you have a question or if you want to make a comment. Yes.
We have that system in South Africa where you can, just for a short period of time, take the guardian of the child to give the infusion, like we have that in Sweden. You can just, the social services say, we take the child now and give it, and then you'll get the child back.
Yes, I believe they do. I don't know how well it is enforced, but yes, it is supposed to be like that. Yeah, and obviously I think it's a good thing, but they will disagree with me. Okay, so the next one is also the emotional turmoil, but focused on the parent. So when you go through a divorce, it's a lot of mixed emotions, especially if there was some kind of abuse in the relationship. I mean, you feel anxiety, you feel liberation, you feel depressed, you feel joy. It's so ambivalent. And then you feel a lot of guilt because you're happy to be free, but you're worried about your children and the future. So you need to help them realize what's going on and go through that process. But you also need to be honest with them that it is going to affect every sphere of your life, because divorce does, and especially if it is divorce from a cult member. For example, financial. I spoke to a woman, her husband was inside the cult, she wasn't, and her children didn't want to be inside as well, two grown-up children, and they were very rich, and the father decided he was going to listen to the leader, and he gave away 38 million, that's about 3.5 million euros. All of their belongings, their farms, their equipment, everything, they just gave to the leader. And the son, the grown-up son, was devastated because he wanted to farm. He was working on the farm already. And then they lost everything to the group because their dad just gave it away and they couldn't do anything about it. So in that case, I mean, it's a huge financial problem at that stage, but also in the future, because that was the son's life. It was his work. Since he was a little boy, he expected that's what he was going to do. Now he needed to find a whole new vocation. He can't study or anything. There's no money. And that's an extreme example, but there are many such examples. And not even just at the beginning or just giving everything, you know that the group in these circumstances, it is that parent's biggest priority, a bigger priority than the children are. So they control your finances, they control so many things of your life. So the mental impact, everyone, is very real. Physically, there are many things that we need to consider. Socially, we already spoke about that, but especially for people who were in the cult themselves and the one parent get out, that was your whole support system. So you do not really have often, you don't really have a support system outside of the cult, but you don't have the a bit fake support system inside the cult as well, because they only support you so far as you actually agree with what they do and say. And it's a very lonely process for those people and for the children as well. And then spiritual and ethical, we can go on about that. And obviously the family and the home. So what I almost always find so interesting is I get the idea of a cancer patient. They sit there and they get chemo and they need to fight this huge fight when they feel their weakest. And it's the same in these circumstances. You have to be so fighting fit, but you're so drained and you're so emotionally, you feel so lost. So that is where we come in and where we really need to help them. The one emotion I want to focus on is the extreme frustration that these parents feel, because they're not only fighting against this person they are divorcing. In many instances, like the father I spoke about earlier, you are fighting a strong force of experts, because in this group, there are lawyers, there are psychologists, there are social workers, there are police members. All of these experts are inside the group, and the one parent doesn't even have to pay for that, because that is expected of the experts to help them. And when I was doing research on it, I found so many articles. For example, one of the Jehovah's Witnesses, where they actually give you tips on what to do if somebody wants to divorce you. And that community is very strong, and often because this parent maybe left the group, they don't have the financial means to pay for a good legal team, and they have no idea where to go and what to do. As somebody said earlier, it's the first time I'm divorcing. So what do I do? And that is where we come in, because we've got the experience and we understand the coercion, and there are many people who can help. Next thing is people feel so frustrated because they're actually divorcing a stranger when that person went into the cult. another parent that I spoke to, he was working, the wife was at home with the children. And then what happened is while he was at home, the Jehovah's Witnesses came and they started to speak to her and she converted. And she changed a lot. And when he found out what was going on, he said, okay, well, something is not right here. He started to do research and he started to try and explain to her what he doesn't agree with. Obviously, that didn't go well. And eventually she left. She took the children with her because they were all influenced. And in this whole divorce proceeding, he felt like he didn't even know his wife anymore because she was so influenced by the group. But on the other side, they know you very well because if you were never part of the group, you didn't change. You're the person that they married and get to know. So it's easier for them to get things to use against the person that's outside of the group than the other way around. Next, it was so interesting to me. My father and I were in a docu-series at the beginning of the year on Showmax, which is basically the South African Netflix, on different high control groups. And whenever I speak to somebody afterwards, they would tell me, you know what, those things you spoke about were crazy. And it's completely understandable that they think that. But just imagine you are divorcing somebody in a cult and you try to explain to people what's going on. They will think you are crazy because how can these things happen? And that is very important to remember. And you won't understand the relief that you see in people's faces when they start to speak to you about everything and you can really validate it. And you can see, yes, I know that happens. Okay, you are right. I can imagine. And you ask questions and they're like, yeah, exactly. How did you know that? And you don't want to tell them because that's what everybody says, but you can tell them about the patterns and how manipulation works. So that is very important for them not to go to their legal counsel if they don't have enough information on it. Tell them this is what happened, that they think, oh man, I'm dealing with a nutcase, at least I will get some money. But to really help them to communicate and articulate everything in the right way. And then again, to keep the moral high ground, even if you're up against very unethical behavior, because at the beginning, especially, it's very hard for the parents. But as time goes on and they keep a diary and let's say the court can see, listen, they've been back for this a few times now. Let's see what's going on. In the end, it usually helps them. Then surviving the legalities. First of all, they need to be able to speak a language that the court can understand, and the court must find out what they need. They must understand what this person and especially the children need, because they can't be biased. They need the information. And that is why you should also help them to get a legal counsel who really understand the dynamics of coercion and control, because that legal representative would know what the judge needs, what information the judge would need to help them. If I can give you an example of that, during COVID, there was a group in Kenya. I don't know if any of you read about it. And in that time, the leader told the parents to take their children out of schools and go and live in the forest. So they did that. And then at the beginning of last year, the leader, while living in a villa close to the beach, obviously, he told them to starve the children. And many people died. There are still 600 people they're looking for, but about, I think the last stats were 429 people, of whom about 200 were children, died of starvation because that is what the leader said. So we really have to make sure, and I mean, if you read those stories, you can look it up. There's one of a mother, the father stayed in the group and she fled with the 5 children and they were hunting her, but she got away. Many others obviously didn't. But for her to explain everything is very, very difficult. But that's where we come in and we guide them. Say, listen, look at this. Obviously, we don't make the decisions. We just guide them to answer the relevant questions so that they can see what's going on. So I'm gonna be very quick with this. What the court looks at when it comes to the legal things when parents are in different religions is they have to look at the best interest of the child always, but they also have to respect the parental rights of the parents. So if the parents are in the same religion, they get divorced, it's not a problem, the child stays in that religion. If they are in different religions, but both religions are socially acceptable, then the court usually say, and that I've read about most countries, obviously not all of them, but that the child should have the opportunity to learn about both religions. But what do we do if they're in different religions and they've got conflicting lifestyles? Like, for example, if one parent is in a cult. The first thing they have to look at is not to violate the religious freedom of the parents. And then they look at the social effects. So not judging the religion itself, but looking at the social effects of that religion. Because let's say the child is being taught to handle venomous snakes. The court would think, okay, that might not be such a good idea. Something might happen, so they take that into consideration. And that gets to the next one as well. Evidence of harm. If there's anything that's very important that you can tell these parents is look for any evidence of harm. That includes many things, but we all understand abuse. So the three most prevalent forms of abuse when it comes to children is sexual, physical, or emotional. Obviously, the first one is very difficult to prove, but there might be ways. The physical abuse is often easier to prove, especially if somebody can actually take the child to a doctor, but also not always. The emotional one I'll touch on later, but that's more difficult, and that is why you need to help the parents to keep a diary and to keep any proof of messages, for example, that was sent between the parents. The medical care, I'm just going to name about 4 because there are so many, but the 4 most common ones is if there's any proof that one of the parents was neglectful in a way when it comes to medical care. Also, the dangerous religious practices, for example, the snake. If there's any interference in the education of the child, like when they live in a commune and the education is not up to the standard of the country. Yeah. Or if it's disencouraged. Parental alienation, again, very important because most courts see that as a very big problem. Since the parents, all of them, I know in South Africa, the parental rights and responsibilities are care, to have the child with you, to care for the child, contact, if the child is with the other parent, maintenance, self-explanatory, and guardianship. So it's actually the parent's right to be a guardian of their children, and the children need that. If they're alienated, they can't fulfill their parental rights and responsibilities as they should. And then, very important, indoctrination and coercive control. I'll touch on that quickly. Indoctrination basically is taking influence. We all have influence over our children, but taking it too far, then it's indoctrination. Just like socially acceptable churches, if I can put it like that. There's also influence, but it's not being taken too far. So next thing in indoctrination, there's a big difference between education and indoctrination. If you educate your children, you provide knowledge to them, okay? And you encourage critical thinking skills, and you also expose them to diverse perspectives. Even if you say, this is my perspective, that's fine. They know there are diverse perspectives out there. But in indoctrination, that is not encouraged. I'm going to be quick now. Coercion, it's very interesting to me that more and more countries come to include that in their legal documents. I've heard this morning about France. The law was just amended in May this year. And Canada, they use that a lot. So there's just 2 examples. The last thing that, if you remember everything, this is the most important thing. In all of these cases, the court always look at the best interest of the child. So for a parent who's not part of the cult, to make sure that the child is not taken away from them by the other parent and the group for that matter, is they have to explain that the best interest of the child is not being looked at. So here are just 3 examples that was in the news. I think all of you might have seen it, where the custody of that day, or the care battle, was actually won by the parent who wasn't part of this high control group. But the legal process was difficult. In the next example, the father, it was in July 2020, the final decision was made by the judge. But this is difficult because it's emotional abuse. And as we said, that's very difficult to prove. So this father, it was a case in the UK, the whole court process took 5 years and it cost him more than £60,000. Luckily for him, he had the money. Obviously, many people don't. But the things that he said was that his daughter told him, these are in his words, he said, she'd say I needed to stir pancakes anti-clockwise, and if I don't, I could die a miserable death. Obviously, the court is not going to look favorably at people who indoctrinate children like that. Or she'd say that eating gluten and soya yogurt even would make a hole in her tummy and she couldn't have babies. So if the court can understand that the child really believes that, and I know there are many different, we spoke about it earlier as well, ways in the different countries. I know in South Africa, we've got the Family Advocate's Office, and then there's a lawyer and a social worker, and they talk to the children if they're a certain age, and they can hear the voice of the child. You can also do it privately, but in many countries, that's very important. I'll be very quick now, sorry. Last thing, I'm just going to jump over it, but the course of action is you need to help them, emotional support and personal healing. They need to go through that process because of all the loss and the suffering and the judgment they experience. And then also they need to work on their relationship with their children. And it really helps if you can give them practical advice. Tell them regarding, well, taking the age of the child into consideration, what they can play with the child, how they can spend time with the child, and educate them. Psychoeducational therapy is so important for anybody who's been in an abusive relationship or who's been in a cult or whose spouse is or was in a cult. They need to understand what's going on in order for them to go through the process, to speak to the legal people and to heal eventually. And also the last one is equip them to give the court clarity on what is or was really going on. The court doesn't know that most legal professionals are not being told how these things work. They don't understand it, and it's not what they studied, so it's not against them. But you have to help the parents to speak a language that the legal system understands so that the children can get the help they need. So again, the parent coordinator, just to give you one example, some of my clients that I work with at the moment as a parent coordinator, the mother phoned me a while back and she said, in the dad's culture or religion, it's very intertwined. The boys, they've got a boy, prepubescent boys need to go to the school of the mountain, which is something in some part of South Africa. And what happens there, nobody really knows, but they come back circumcised and yeah, many other things that happen there. And she told me, listen, I'm very afraid of what's going to happen here. And she's got reason to be afraid because in 2019, 12 boys died in one of these School of the Mountains. And then obviously that is why she called me and she said, listen, what are we going to do now? Because if he's in the father's care, he can actually take him there. So we needed to start a process to look into that. But that is why a parent coordinator or somebody, it doesn't have to be exactly that, that can help with that is so, so important. And as I said, the timeline and the evidence. Okay, that's a mouthful. Any questions? I think we've got 2 or 3 minutes.